Hey everybody, I'm going to take a quick look at chapter 15, which is on transition. So again, transition isn't necessarily a specific disability category, but it's more of an idea. We also have some legal definitions in regards to transition that we're going to go over. But first, some background information. So we've talked about a lot of students with disabilities, and the idea of pretty much all services that we provide in special education is to provide the best outcome, which is what's the ultimate outcome of school, which is you're creating, the next generation of citizenry in your civilization, right? That's why we have schooling and education, so we have skilled, workers and citizens. If we didn't need those, we wouldn't have such a need for education. It would be more of an elective thing. Like, for example, back in the Dark Ages and under like early day monarchies and empires and stuff like that, we only had a very small learned ruling class, because for those people, the education was important and learning was important. But for the other, the other unwashed masses, the serfs, they mindfully suppressed education because they didn't want learned, enlightened people in their citizenry. So we always have to understand, why are we in school in the first place? So we can contribute and participate in society. This doesn't change just because a student has a disability. Students with disabilities are trying to participate in society and contribute to the extent that they can. That's kind of one of our human conditions. And even in, I think it's Erickson's, it's the idea of generativity versus despair. I believe that's the phase. It's like trust versus mistrust, onward from there. But generativity versus despair. This happens kind of in middle adulthood, where people are, think to themselves, have I contributed to society? Yes, and that's a reaffirming thing, and it keeps them going. If no, that causes a major identity and emotional crisis on this specific stepping stone. So, anyways, back to my point. The ultimate outcome of school is to create the next generation of citizenry, and this doesn't change for people with disabilities. So let's look at some numbers. We can see here, according to at least Heward statistics, that we have almost 20% fewer students with disabilities graduate from high school as opposed to the overall population average. That's 60% of students with disabilities are going to graduate with their 4-year high school diploma, which is really, it's not very good. Not very good at all. As well as you see increased numbers as far as in certain sort of other like environmental issues and environmental evidence of, I guess, maladjustment or otherwise non-participation or otherwise improper or other participation in society in general. So you can see that here, and I've given you guys a slightly different number, but at least according to the transition survey, 57% of students with disabilities are considered unemployed within the first 4 years of them being out of school. Now, granted, there's a couple things that are influencing this number, because I've said the number between about 70 and 80%. If you were to take out students with, because you have to think, all students with disabilities, that's anybody with an IEP, including students who are fully mainstreamed in the general education classroom, who don't really need a ton of supports, maybe get one or two things for extremely mild on the end. Those people are included. What you see is, when you see the idea of apparent, visually apparent or outwardly apparent disabilities, this usually physical disabilities, to some extent intellectual disabilities, and to a certain extent autism because of certain behaviors that are manifested, but definitely with physical disabilities, that's deafness, blindness, mobility impairments, just in general. If you were to take out the big group of ADHD and you're going to take out the big group of specific learning disabilities, you would be left with a much higher percentage of students who would be considered unemployed. Just to kind of clarify that for you guys. But look at some of these other statistics. First of all, we get the social engagement of students with disabilities pretty high, almost 50%. But look at this as a negative thing. 28% of students out of high school with disabilities have been arrested at some point. Now, remember that can include intellectual disabilities, emotional and behavioral disabilities. And this is a very important point because we have to understand that we are dealing with a vulnerable and potentially emotionally volatile demographic of students. These students can be specifically vulnerable to manipulation from, from anybody. We'll talk about this later on in the chapter. Oftentimes, street gangs try to find relatively green, as it were, or naive or otherwise, at-risk students to do entry-level stuff for them. They could be a mule, or they could do something, or do other sorts of gang-related tasks. And it's a give for get, because that gang may offer that particular person protection, or they may give them money, or they may give them drugs, or they could do they do provide either something emotional or something tangible and concrete to that particular person, but usually it ends up being a token gesture to try and gain that person's support, and then you get this kind of systematic manipulation that starts to happen, where basically you have these kind of criminal mastermind people with these kind of vulnerable people underneath their pinky, as it were. But also understand that students, there's a higher absenteeism rate, higher truancy rate, a higher drug abuse rate. So all of those things can, lead to the idea of, more students with disabilities being caught up in some sort of problem than other students. Also, you can see only 60% of youth saw themselves as useful and important and the ability to handle real life. That's a pretty big problem, especially because a lot of these students have gone through 12 years of special education. A lot of them, some haven't, obviously, but the whole point of special education is to try and treat and to try to foster this independence, and to foster this idea of self-identity or self-worth. That's at least the way that I see it. But for one reason or another, they see the people around them, they see how they're excluded. They may see other people who have gone before them who have had subsequent problems trying to find work and to have a happy, gameful life. That all can affect on a person's view of themselves. So basically, according to IDEA, we start transition at 16. Indiana is different. Okay, this is important. Remember this. Indiana, we start at 14, not 16. In Indiana, we start at 14. That's Indiana's law. We do it a little better than everybody else, and I'll brag about that. Specific things that we talk about transition services. We can really break it down into three things: education, independent living, and work. Okay, those really are three categories. Work, we're going to talk about the different kinds of work. Independent living, that's also on a spectrum. And then education, which is also on a spectrum, from community college, trade school, to 4-year education, adult education. They're all on a spectrum. But basically those three things: education, work, and employment. I'm sorry, education, work, and independent living. I doubled up there. So we talked about this transition plan, or it's going to be called the TIEP. Starts in Indiana at age 14, and it really addresses all the same things as the traditional IEP, except we address the three things that we talked about in the last slide. What's education after high school, independent living after high school, work after high school. And not only that, we're going to create goals for each of those, especially if we need to build some specific skills which can help students get to where they want to go on those specific areas. Let's say, for example, we can make a goal on independent living to maybe do budgeting, or we can maybe make a goal where they're going to practice using public transit, or they're going to make a goal doing certain household tasks, cooking, cleaning, etc., etc. So, this idea of education, it starts with the idea of post-secondary education. And first of all, with the increases and improvements in special education, we're seeing better outcomes. And better outcomes are meaning students who are achieving on a grade and age level with their non-disabled classmates to the extent where they are, they have, by their merit, been, found eligible to continue and receive post-secondary education. That doesn't necessarily mean a four-year college, but it can. There's an increase in students going to four-year colleges. There's an increase in students with disabilities going to two-year colleges. There's an increase in students with disabilities going to community colleges. Pretty much across the board, there's more students with disabilities who are seeking higher education, and we can thank all the hard work that we in special education have done to try and advance the idea that people with disabilities can go to college, because I think 40 years ago that might have been a question to a lot of people. And secondly, we're actually preparing students to be able to, first of all, earn admittance to college on a merit-based system, and two, hopefully give them the skills to be able to be successful and to be able to stay in college and not just go and be one and done and then be home. But furthermore, on education, post-secondary education doesn't just mean college, okay? This can mean a trade school, people that want to do electrician, plumbing, carpentry. I had a friend who hated school, and the guidance counselor at our school always pushed college. That was the only acceptable alternative for students. And I think that's bad for a couple of reasons. The idea that we have to force students into college, that is not the right attitude to take. Okay, we need to look on a case-by-case student basis on what students like, what students are good at, what students want to do, what are the students' plans for the student's life. And I don't know could potentially be an answer. That's why in Indiana we start the transition process at 14, because then we're going to start some career exploratory activities and get them ready to be able to answer that question, because we basically have, students age out at 22. So if they take the maximum amount of time that they can take, they can have 8 years to prepare themselves. Or when you normally age out, it's like 18 and a half years old. So 4, plus years to get yourself ready to go to the next step in your life. So that's a pretty long time, and you can make some pretty good headway in that. So back to my original point on the idea of everybody should go to college and college is the only acceptable outcome is not correct, and it should not be pushed by guidance counselors, and I detest and I argue with guidance counselors who push this, although it's not a very popular opinion. Okay, so I have a friend who was not successful in school, okay, between his learning disabilities, and he also had an emotional disability, didn't like it, loved working with his hands, was an extremely good artist. But at the same time, he was just very good. He had very good fine motor skills. He also thought very mechanically, so he was the type of kid that could fix your car and whatnot. So although he got push from my guidance counselor, it's like, why would you not want to go to college? That's the only anybody who's anybody goes to college. Well, no. So what that person is basically, that guidance counselor has made any other noble craft and profession that doesn't necessarily involve college, has made that less than, has made it second class, and that's not true. My friend went into mechanics, right, as ASE or something he went into some auto workers union, I forget what it was, but anyways, went through apprenticeship, got to his journeyman, and started working in a mechanic shop, and he was 21 years old, making $55K as a mechanic, right? A good mechanic, and he was an electrical mechanic too, because cars are basically computers now. So not only do you have to be good with mechanics, but you have to be good with computers, and he was really good at both of those things. So here he is being extremely successful, and I'm sure just completely sticking his tongue out at our old guidance counselor in high school, because it's what did you say? Who was going to be successful from going to college? He would have gone to college, probably not done very well, probably got some degree in something he didn't care about, and then he would have been pushed into some desk job that, getting out of college at a desk job, if you're making $30,000 a year, that's a pretty good job. You should hold on to that. So he's doing better, but there's the preconception of this person that college was the only acceptable alternative. is actually a very destructive attitude to have. We need to make a decision. We need to make decisions on case-by-case basis and understand that there's a variety of good post-secondary options for students, including college, including community school, including adult ed, and including skilled trades. This is important because we have this thing called the skills gap, okay? And we're not going to get too much into that, but skills gap basically says we have a bunch of kids going to college that aren't getting licenses with their college degrees, and they're spending 100 plus K, on a gender studies or like a philosophy degree, okay? And then they're getting out of college and they're wondering why nobody wants to hire them. It's because you don't have any marketable skills other than the fact that you can probably write, a halfway decent paper, and you can take tests and remember information. Yeah, that's a pretty good baseline to separate people who can learn and remember things from people who can't. Yes, I understand that that's a good baseline information, but we need to put people in jobs where the skills are. That's why we're trying to push STEM. Okay, that's why education is a great field to be in, because you're going to be getting out of school making 40K in a lot of districts. There's not a lot of 23-year-olds making 40K out of school. I'll tell you that right now. Okay, especially if you're not in STEM. So let's look at employment for people with disabilities. We talked about the high rate of unemployment, okay? But let's talk about why is employment important, okay? Employment offers meaning. Employment offers purpose. It offers generativity. Generativity is this idea that it offers us this ability to advance, okay, the ability to progress ourselves, both internally and externally, both with our internal pride and image of ourselves, but also our external, public standing. And, when people respect us, it makes us respect ourselves more. And if we do a good job, you at least ideally be respected for it, and it has a carryover effect to your own self-image. In career education, this is an excellent way of at least introducing this idea of jobs. And we can actually tier this in. Elementary school, we can have this idea of job exploration. What does a cook do, right? You can have classroom jobs that can emulate specific things, like the mailman, or you could be the, like sanitation person. But then, I also did things like virtual field trips. I would take them to the sewage plant. I would take these little videos and we'd show them what the treatment plant looks like. Maybe you like some kids really liked big trucks and big instruments, so we'd show them forklifts and bulldozers and stuff like that. Well, guess what? If you have a CDL and you have a forklift operator's license and you have a heavy machinery operator's license, you are making good money, my friend. Like that is not a profession or a career that should be viewed as anything but honorable, hard, and decent work, right? So we can start to show career exploration very, very early on, and that doesn't always include the typical skills gap types of things that we try and by default push people into. Oh, we have to learn how to push paper and go to college and sit there. Careers involve doing and things with our hands as well. We can't forget that. In middle school, right, we can get, and then we go into high school, we can then start transitioning. We can go from shadowing, and then in high school maybe we can do an internship program. And if we can't do an internship program, maybe we can do some sort of home operation. I know in Muncie Central, I was actually in charge of their plausibilities lab for a half a semester, for an entire semester, but basically it was a workshop for students who weren't diploma track, but it would give them job skills so that they could be successful in customer service. So it was a great program, and it taught them some very good skills. Like I said, career education, we can start it early, career exploration, because this is the issue that we have. If you ask a kid that's not thinking critically about what they want to be when they grow up, what kind of answers do you get? In my experience, you get the Superman, James Bond, NBA, a football player, an astronaut, and not to hate on the astronaut, but basically we see kids that are shooting for the 1 in a million type jobs, especially the 1 in a million jobs that have a lot to do with innate physical features and ability, as opposed to things that you can work and improve on. So showing students an array of jobs is good because you get that critical thinking process going, and they're like, hey, I like that, I can do that, think that looks fun, right? Because that's how we get the seeds of what we want to do for our career. I, or you give them a good experience that lasts with them. I mean, how many people are now in education because they had an experience that lasted and stuck with them for a long time? We can provide those experiences to our students in different ways. Okay, so this idea of employment, competitive employment, is this idea where it's either full or part-time, and it's basically would be the same type of job and benefits as a non-disabled person. So it would be, right, at least at the minimum wage, and this is an issue that Goodwill's been going with lately, but not less than what would be considered the customary wage. So basically, it has to be what everybody else, any other tier level person would be getting paid. Now, that being said, companies are getting a little bit more scrutiny in their practices on how they do things. And in the age of today, it would be terrible PR. It would be an absolute legal nightmare, and they would end up paying probably millions and millions of dollars to save $5,000 a year. And I mean, the amount of face that a company would lose by practicing this kind of this practice would be in the millions when they can just pay. It's called being a penny wise and a pound foolish, as the saying. But basic, doing something little to try and save yourself and end up really just like completely screwing up the big picture. But I'm sure that there are instances where this sort of practice does occur. But basically, the idea of competitive employment, it's a person that is receiving market rate wages and benefits. We also have supported employment. This is usually has to do with having competitive wages and things like that, but there's going to be the incorporation of some supports. That could be through vocational rehabilitation, that can be through a job placement type of a program, and they give you a few models. The small business model, small businesses are great for that because it's a smaller, it's a closer knit workforce. It's more kind of community oriented than the big, cold, bureaucratic machines of the multinational corporations. And then you have things like enclaves and mobile work crews where people basically do, they're kind of like mercenaries. They do contracted work and they move around together, and work together. And then you got the idea of individual placement in general. So usually, like I said, through vocational rehabilitation, that's an office in the federal government. They have these basically counselors or employment coaches or specialists that will help provide services to the actual person, but then also provide services and information to the company to help the company better include that person in the workforce. And then lastly, we have this idea of sheltered employment, which is more of a part employment, part like workshop, or part like skill center. So it's usually people that or otherwise don't have the skills for competitive employment, or for whatever reason cannot get into competitive employment, where they can go and work, and they can gain skills and they can gain work experience. They can learn certain routines and certain practices of day-to-day work types of life and responsibility in general. But at the same time, there's some special provisions for sheltered employment. Now, the one thing that's been going on is Goodwill. There was a big thing for Goodwill that they were paying under minimum wage for their sheltered workshop employees, and they said, well, it's a job training program. Like it is a job. It's like an internship. When you student teach, you're not going to get paid. Okay, it feels bad, but it is what it is. It's a job training program. You are being trained to do the job of teaching, so it's still kind of a teaching skills, like it's like a school, like a skill acquisition placement. That's the rationale that they use in this sheltered workshop environment. So they say, yes, but we also provide supports. We specifically tailor this to teach skills, to develop future competitive employees or future supported employees. The idea is to build up from sheltered employment to more competitive employment. So that's the whole idea for employment and education. As far as residential options, we have once again a full spectrum. We can go from all the way independent living with no supports to independent living with some support, and that could be a nursing care. This could be lawn or like snow removal types of things, especially if a person's like in a wheelchair. You probably want to get up like snow removal and lawn care. But if a person just has a cognitive if a person has a cognitive disability, you may not need to get snow removal or lawn care. Then it might be different. It really depends on the person and the disability and the severity. You may need medical help. You may need not. You may need to retrofit some things on the house, especially if you're in a wheelchair. You need to retrofit things like cabinet height and light fixture and other sorts of like things like like sockets and outlets in the wall, and then also switches and things like that. You want to put them in a more accessible height. So you might be doing some. Would a house need retrofitting? What sort of places have more accessible design? My mother's been in public housing for 40 years, so I know all about the housing aspect of inclusion for disabilities, because they've spent literally tens of millions of dollars specifically on a independent living center. So I've learned quite a bit about this particular end. But then we also have less individual types of places. I mean, we have things like group homes, which are basically where people can live together, and they can either be there as a transitionary, and that's I think what the book is trying to differentiate foster homes from group homes. But basically the idea of foster home is that it's supposed to be a temporary transitional housing. Whereas a group home could be a more permanent basis, or it could still be transitional housing. But basically, the idea of people live together to live and cohabitate together, and also provide mutual support for each other, etc. Recreation and leisure, we have to make sure some other things too, because when we're talking about living a full life and participating in the community, that goes well beyond just being able to work and have skills and live independently. There's some subsequent things that we need just to be happy as well. The idea of recreation and leisure, once again, we had 50%, almost 49% of students that participated in some sort of out of school activity. I mean, people need things to do to occupy their time. People need to have hobbies because it's good for their own mental well-being. It's good for your mental well-being. There can be some things that can be barriers to access for participation. Transportation being one, especially for students or people with specific physical disabilities, that many people with disabilities don't drive. So that makes it, how do you get around when you don't drive? I always kind of halfway laugh when I get emails, and I do every semester, and it's like, oh, Mr. B, I can't go to such and such a school. I don't have my car. And it's like, well, I mean, your legs work. Okay, I've never driven a car in my life. How did I get to school? How did I get to work? Like, do I ever use that as a complaint from my boss as to why I can't? And obviously, I've had students with physical disabilities, and that's going to be something that you direct at them. But, just in general, it's like, well, I don't understand what your excuse is here, because, people with disabilities, they don't have access to a car. Or, some people with disabilities don't have access to cars. And some of those people also, live, have full-time jobs, go to the store. And I think the way you put that is, well, you could take your BMW, that's the bike, that's the mitts, and walking, BMW. So, and the idea of a car being the end-all and the be-all of the transportation is, false. So, anyways, I jest, and I always jest in my people. But yeah, every semester it's like, oh, I can't go to such and such a place. Well, that's never. I mean, has never been an option for me. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Um, but anyways, yeah. So we might have to deal with transportation. We may have to worry about how do we modify, the game. Do we need to make any changes? Do we need to possibly have, is the environment on which it's going to play or take place, is that something where we need to possibly modify that as well? This idea of sexuality in dating, this is one thing that I think that some people don't think that people with disabilities get old and truly grow up. And one of the most natural, I mean, if we're really going back to biology, one of the most natural ways that we grow up is we sexually develop into men and women. Okay, we develop our sexual organs so that we can reproduce and create future generations of us. Otherwise, we go extinct, right? There's no other way around it. Why anyone would think that this somehow is different for people with disabilities, I don't understand it. I think that it's just people are uncomfortable with it, so they kind of go la la la, and they plug their ears and they don't think about it for whatever reason. But at the same time, it's something that we shouldn't ignore. Okay, and a lot of times we try to repress these sorts of things and not talk about it because I don't know how I don't know how people feel uh, about the idea of people with disabilities being either active members in the dating pool or have innate sexual urges or hormones in their body that affect their behavior and things like that. Like that's silly to think that all people don't experience that sort of thing relatively similarly. This is specifically important when we're talking about people with disabilities because we almost need to do more to inform and to educate them, because one of the biggest things that we see is this idea of issues of adaptive behavior. Okay, we're going back to chapter 4 here, but many other chapters too, including autism, among others, and emotional and behavioral disabilities. This idea of adaptive behavior, understanding context clues of society. So, we need to be able to actually, absolutely teach those skills. Like okay, especially if you have a kid that's maybe in 5th or 6th grade, that's just like discovering, themselves in that way. And then all of a sudden, like, you have like a touching problem, like a self-touching in class problem. And that's, you have to address that. You may have to address that if you're teaching, even 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. You probably have to address that at some point. But we also have to understand that we have to teach appropriate interactions with people. This is one of the problems that I have with some of the it's the challenged buckaroos. If you remember the video from inclusion that we talked about, this idea of challenged buckaroos, where it's like, oh, we created just the special, or it's like the special prom or the special rodeo. These exclusionary types of atmospheres. I don't know if they're trying to keep people with disabilities away from the rest of the community at large, but I'm not exactly sure what. But when we have okay, when I was a student, I was recruited very heavily to be in Best Buddies because I'll quote a friend of mine who's a teacher in Kokomo now, and she basically said that we lose girls every year because one of the buddies basically acts like inappropriately towards them or make a pass at them or something, and they get kind of creeped out and they quit the program. So they need more male buddies for the male programs, or for the male they need more male buddies, as in college students, for the male buddies, as in the people with disabilities. Now I love Best Buddies, and don't get me wrong, but I'm kind of in a hiatus of supporting Best Buddies, and I'm sorry if Christy, you found this video and you're watching it. I have all the respect in the world, for you personally, but I think there's a couple things that the students have done in quite a few Best Buddies programs that I've personally witnessed that I don't particularly agree with. Number one is they basically conscripted people who are not willing participants to join the program just to fill the amount of interest that there was from the kids. And then number two, I've seen things where they do things like have like dances or something like that. And I don't think that there's enough adequate training of how to interact. So if I had $1 for every time I've seen a person kind of act cutesy towards a person with a disability, it's like, oh, you're so cute, I love you, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, and if you have, and I mean, if you have, let's say, a young, attractive girl, okay, saying, I love you to you, and you already have some sort of disability, that maybe makes it harder for you to understand the context on which you're talking about. Like, you're setting yourself up for a problem, okay? And it's not that person's fault because you said something, okay? And they took it out of context because they have a disability, which makes it harder for them to take it properly within context. So we don't need to be fake about sexuality and dating. We need to be honest. We have to be upfront. But then at the same time, we can't just act like it doesn't exist and that people with disabilities are these cute platonic creatures and they just don't have a dirty thought in their mind in the world, because that's not biology. So last slide of our entire year, guys. What's the whole point? And I've talked about this. The ultimate point of education is to create the next generation of people, and to give students the best life that they can. We look at the numbers, and yeah, this number says, right around like 59%, I think it was. But still, if you take out the relatively mild, overly mild disabilities, and you only look at outwardly apparent disabilities, we're looking at a very, very high unemployment rate. And that nobody wants to be unemployed. Nobody wants to sit at home and take a check from the government. I don't know a single person with a disability who gets a check from the government that gets it every month and just sits there and smiles and says, yeah, I'm so happy I pulled one over on you. I'm just going to sit here with my hundreds of dollars a month that I get from the government and just live like a king. First of all, you don't get that much money out of Social Security. You do not live a very good quality of life. Secondly, okay, the idea that you're taking and not contributing is something that people understand and they know. And that makes them feel bad, right? I would, and I mean, I've taken Social Security, especially when I was getting started, and I'm not going to apologize for it. And I probably paid the majority of it back from working, but it's, but nobody enjoys taking that. We want to get as many people in the workforce, in society in general, as we can. But to do that, we have to properly train them. We cannot send poorly trained students out into the workforce, because that has a ripple effect on other students. If we send someone, and I've had this personally happen to me, okay, if you're working in a program where you're trying to place students with disabilities into some sort of community program, if you send someone that's not well trained, and then I end up getting an email about it saying blah blah blah, so and so did this and they weren't ready, and I don't want another person ever again, and I'm done with this program. So great. Our inability to properly train and judge when people are ready to go and get ready, right, has basically not only affected that particular person, that child, okay, or that student, because they're no longer, they lost that opportunity to be in that program. Number two, we've affected that employer because we've given them a negative attitude and perspective of people with disabilities, and his future interactions and thoughts about people with disabilities are ultimately going to be weighed down by that specific instance, and it's going to be in a negative way. And it's going to take many, many positive instances for him to really forget about that specific instance. And it's not good for anybody. It's not good for the school either, because we may lose opportunities to be able to work with other developers if we don't provide success stories. If it has to be more benefit than it is harm and problem. So and that's most students with this, and not to say that like we have to make some sort of crazy or ridiculously exceptional plan or anything for a lot of students who have disabilities. We don't have to do that much, but we do have to teach, we have to hold students with disabilities accountable, because in the real world they're going to be held accountable, and they may cry and they might not like it now, but when we teach them, and when they're older and they understand and it's paying off, why responsibility is paying off, when they're being successful in their job, which is allowing them to be more successful in their life, which is giving them a better self outlook and impact on themselves, then I don't think they're going to come to me and be complaining about why did I get on you for being responsible about something, because we taught them, and teaching comes with failure. That's part of the thing. That's why I try to create a safe environment, in my classes. And although sometimes I might get on you guys for doing some specific things, I'll always know that it's specifically in the interest of trying to teach you specific skills, responsibility, time management, multitasking. You're learning a lot more than just education in this class. You're learning basic, and you're being tested on basic life responsibility skills that are going to make you successful down the road, and ultimately as a teacher. And that's what we're trying to do for our particular students. Because, being that one person who exposes a child to a career that they ultimately may want to do, you may be the difference between them actually being pointed towards a career, or them being just, shepherded into some, oh, well, I just think that this was going to be the best. And the person making that decision might be just some counselor somewhere, or we don't want that. We want the child to be absolutely determinate in their future, and to have not only the knowledge but the understanding of themselves and what they want with their life. And that's one of the big things that we're trying to teach. So just to recap on Chapter 15, this idea of transition. In Indiana, we start at 14. Nationally, it's 16. When we're talking about transition, basically it's education, it's work, and it's independent living. So we have a TIEP, Transition IEP, which basically covers all the same things as the IEP, except we do address the transition goals of those 3 specific areas. More students are achieving post-secondary education, which is absolutely, we're going in the right direction. And the endpoint is to get to competitive employment, which is basically market level employment without supports. We do have a couple of stepping stones to get to that point, including supported employment, which is basically market level employment, but with some supports, maybe from VR or vocational rehabilitation or something like that. And then we have sheltered employment, which is basically not competitive employment in wages, but it's more focused on, well, yes, you are doing work. That is a byproduct of being there, but you're also learning. You're learning skills, you're learning routine, you're learning responsibility. So yes, there is a debate and a controversy as to what should be the payoff and what should be the benefit to the actual employee for that specific work, but that debate will rage on for another day. The idea also that there's a spectrum between independent living and group living or assisted living, depending on the needs, and we should basically address that on a case-by-case basis. Also understand that people are pretty multi-dimensional, and we have to give them recreation and leisure activities. They like doing, people like doing things. People need to get out. People cannot be shut-ins, right? There's all sorts of research that shows, right, how bad, that is for people's mental psyche. And sometimes that comes with some adaptations. We need adaptable transportation. We might need to adapt physical boards or things like that. But, we can include pretty much people in all sorts of leisure activities. Sexuality and dating. Understand that people, are biological beings, and that includes coming to terms with their own sexuality and their own adolescence. And that comes, we cannot hide from that. We cannot sit and act like it doesn't occur. We have to provide information and education, because going back to when we were looking at the idea of what a high percentage of students are actually arrested at some point, this 28% right here, under the idea of sexuality and dating, we have to understand that maybe girls with specific disabilities, cognitive, emotional, or otherwise, are going to be more vulnerable for sexual exploitation and mistreatment, abuse, and things like that. And I don't want to see any person, male or female, abused sexually or any other way, just because they don't have either the coping skills, the ability to say no, some sort of self-image issue, which manifests itself in going on with things unwillingly because of the idea of belonging or acceptance. There's a million different things, but ultimately we have to take this seriously, and we have to understand that all children are really just biological beings, and we can't not But then also to be careful of ourselves when we are personally interacting with people with especially people with certain kinds of behavioral or cognitive awareness, like cognitive, emotional, behavioral, or even autism, with the idea of lack of context and communication. We cannot, you know, it, being nice is one thing, but not, this, don't make it something into teasing, right? It's understand that like words have meanings, okay? And for people that have a hard time understanding nuance or subtlety, if you say something but don't mean it, and it's taken the wrong way, don't throw your hands up and like say, how could this possibly happen to me? Like, you did that, okay? You said the words, you put the ball in motion. So just be very mindful with your words, and to treat treat people with disabilities the same way that you would treat, anyone else. If you wouldn't want your boss misinterpreting something you may say as sexual or as, anything like that, you wouldn't say that to your boss. So why would you say it to some stranger, right? Because it's not, you're not dealing, especially with adults. It's not like it's not. Your words have meanings. Your words have consequences. And then last but not least, the idea of why do we teach? Why do we put kids in school? Why do we help students with disabilities? Because we want to give them the best life we can. We want them to be able to work. We want them to be able to live as independently as they can. We want them to have the skills to be able to be safe and protect themselves, and to advocate for themselves, and to empower themselves, to participate further. That's the ultimate goal. And sometimes I think when we have little kids, we don't see them as old people. But even in first grade, right, you're transitioning them, okay? They just have a little bit more time to learn skills than kids who are older. But, this is the ultimate end goal. Alright guys, well that's it for chapter 15. As always, I appreciate you for listening. And I will have the instructions for the chapter 13 through 15 up soon. So once again, thanks, and take it easy.